As many of you probably know, over the previous week, Jordan Peterson has been in the United Kingdom and appearing on many television shows, primetime television shows, that is, where mainstream audiences will probably listen. These shows include The Right Stuff, Daily Politics, and BBC Two's Breakfast Show with Chris Evans. And overall, Jordan Peterson has naturally done his outstanding performance in defending his views and deconstructing and refuting every argument put at him that he does not agree with. Jordan Peterson came to the UK primarily to give one of his lectures in his tour about the 12 Rules for Life at the Apollo, somewhere in London. I unfortunately couldn't get tickets to this lecture, but I am going to be making it to his big one at the O2 with Sam Harris and Douglas Murray. But from what I understand, the Apollo one was, like his other lectures, fantastic to go and listen to and ask him questions at. But I want to go to the mainstream. The first show that Jordan Peterson appeared on was Start the Week on BBC Radio 4. He was on a panel with 3 other people. Hashim Mohammed, who came to the country at 9 years old with very little English, but in his time, with hard work, skill and luck, managed to become a barrister in the UK judicial system. He also had the Irish author Louise O'Neill, who has been challenging stereotypes and gender roles with her book, which is a reconstruction of The Little Mermaid, and I hear it has an awful ending, unlike the real Little Mermaid. And then we have the Pulitzer Prize winner journalist Lawrence Wright, who turns his focus on the state of Texas, which both confirm and deny Peterson's position. Overall, the show was a good listen, and Peterson was given a lot of challenging questions, but he managed to refute them, as he always does, as we can see in this clip.
Jordan Peterson, coming back to you. The book you've written is very much about, it begins with this notion of balance between order and chaos. I mean, you draw on Tao and the ideas of yin and yang. The subtitle of your book, though, is, and what's important there is balance between those two things, but the subtitle of your book is An Antidote to Chaos, not the middle way between order and chaos, an antidote to chaos. Why an antidote to chaos rather than the middle way?
Well, I think the middle way is the important way, but I think at the moment that our culture is suffering from an excess of chaos. We have a moral relativism as a fundamental ethos. We're detached from our underlying religious metaphors and stories. People in universities in particular, I see this, are in crisis in relationship to their culture and their vision and destiny, especially among men, although certainly not exclusively. And we've emphasized individual rights rather than responsibilities in the West for like 3 generations. And so I think there's a tremendous imbalance at the moment, and I was trying to rectify that in part.
One of the things I love about Jordan Peterson is that I can just leave a clip of him talking and I don't need to reinforce what he's saying just because he does it so well. But we'll continue with the clip because this is where he gets challenged and false accusations are forced on him.
One of the reasons when you give talks that you get protesters attending as well as adoring fans is, I think, that you've gendered order and chaos.
Well, I haven't.
Well, you haven't. You say you haven't. You say you've inherited a gendering. Why should they be gendered at all?
Well, because our fundamental cognitive axioms are social cognitive. We see the world as a gendered place. We see the world through a social lens. I mean, we evolved in a social environment, and so our deepest intuitions are to interpret the world as a set of characters, and those characters come gendered. And generally speaking, Mother Nature is a representative of chaos because she's destructive but also plenipotential, I would say, and order is patriarchal, which everyone uses that metaphor.
I thought you didn't believe in the patriarchy.
I don't.
So why I'm slightly puzzled as to how you can have a distillation of gender in one sense as a social inheritance, but not.
Well, the word patriarchy in our culture has become synonymous with arbitrary tyranny and oppression. And I don't regard our culture as arbitrarily tyrannical or oppressive. And I don't believe the narrative that pits women against men or men against women as the core narrative of our culture. I think that's absurd.
Well, I want to pick up that word arbitrary because you talk also about consciousness as being masculine. You have a moment in your book where you say Neumann and Jung, who is very important to you, say that consciousness was masculine.
It's symbolically masculine.
It seemed almost comically transparent to me that they decide what gender are we going to apply to consciousness? Well, we're men. It probably looks like us. You write this as well. It is certain that a woman needs consciousness to be rescued, and as noted above, consciousness is symbolically masculine and has been since the beginning of time. But consciousness is an intellectual concept. It doesn't have a gender.
What makes you think it's an intellectual concept? Consciousness isn't an intellectual concept.
Well,
it's a phenomenon.
It's a thing in the world, but women...
Yes,
so
our
in what
conceptualization of it is an intellectual construct.
In what sense is it masculine?
It's masculine symbolically, and
well,
the radical
Who decided that?
investigations well, that's a core element of fundamental mythology. It's been a principle of metaphorical cognition for forever. It's not an arbitrary decision by any stretch of the imagination.
It is.
I wanted to leave that running to really hammer home the point that I really don't need to say anything in defence of Jordan Peterson for his ideas, because everything he said there makes sense to anyone that understands the basic underlying principles of what he's saying. So basically he's saying consciousness is a phenomenon. It is a fact of the world. It's not an intellectual construction. If it was an intellectual construction, we wouldn't be able to symbolically apply anything to it. And he says symbolically we apply the masculine to it because throughout history and throughout mythology, from different cultures, that is what we have applied to it, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, I think. But I want to go on ahead in this radio program because there is a better question from the feminist directed at Jordan Peterson, more about gender roles and how they say Peterson reinforces them when all he's doing is observing history and mythology. So they're on the subject of the disenfranchisement of young men, and this is the feminist about to bring up a point about male disenfranchisement being blamed on the fact that they can't express feelings.
I was just going to say, I mean, we see that in the West as well. I mean, in Ireland, 80% of all suicides are by young men. Men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than by women. And you know, that is, again, I think, an inability to express themselves because men have not traditionally been given enough space under patriarchal society to be vulnerable, because they see vulnerability or expressing that sort of emotion as being weak. And that's why I think that the rates of mental health issues and suicide are so high amongst young men, particularly in Western societies.
Jordan Peterson, I noticed, I don't think it was it'd be wrong to characterise it as a flinch, but a reaction. When Louise was talking, you've written this as well. If men are pushed too hard to feminise, they will become more and more interested in harsh fascist political ideology. That seemed to me an odd thing to say.
It's a standard psychoanalytic idea. It's not a harsh thing to say at all. If you deny people's essential nature, competitive nature, for example,
isn't it
there's
classic,
going to be a kickback. And to think of that as enculturated purely is just incorrect.
Yes, but isn't it the classic abuser's exculpation? It's a withdrawal from responsibility. You pushed me to it. You made me hit you.
It's not a justification. It's just an observation of what's likely. If you push people too far in a particular direction, it's a warning, not a justification.
But the solution to that is not to worry about feminising men. It's perhaps to worry about men joining fascist organisations.
No, I think it's to worry about the sorts of things that Lawrence already talked about, and the probability that like steep, unequal hierarchies will produce desperate young men. And that's actually a critique of hierarchy, by the way.
Louise O'Neill.
Yeah, I have 2 points there. I suppose the first one is that when you talk about, feminizing men, it almost sounds derogatory. It's almost as if you're saying that to be feminine or to express any sort of femininity is actually inferior to masculinity. And I think that is a huge problem even within the language that we use. When you say, don't be such a girl, don't be such a pussy, the greatest insults that men can give each other tend to have feminine origins, like, as I said, pussy or faggot or anything like that. And I think, again, that speaks to a very systematic inequality between the genders. And
you attributed the rates of mental illness among men to their inability to express, say, sentimental emotions. Well, and I don't think there's a shred of clinical evidence to support that stance.
No.
I don't think there's a shred of evidence to support that stance. The kind of violence, for example, that Lawrence is discussing is a consequence of competitive competitive violence among
I think
young
there
men
is.
as they move
I think there
towards-
is some evidence that men find it
Yes.
difficult to talk about things, and that
And they also
ways
find it
in which
hard
you can
to
help
reach
young
out.
men to
They-
talk about
they-
things.
And that's the
reduces-
evidence for
Yeah.
the differential rates of mental health
And
suffering? I don't
you
think
know,
so.
I also don't think when you're talking about things being so innate, you know, I mean, Judith Butler would have said that, you know, gender is a construct, that gender is a performance.
Well,
and
Judith
if you
Butler
look,
doesn't know what she's talking about in the least, so
well,
I don't accept
I mean,
that.
that's
as a-
interesting, but
she's no
I agree
scientist.
with
She
her.
doesn't know the
well, then if you look
psychological
at someone like
literature.
Cordelia Fine, who wrote The Delusions of Gender.
Hashim,
As you can probably hear from that, the feminists seemed a bit flustered and wasn't really sure what to say, and then defaults to going to quoting gender theorists who, as Jordan Peterson says, they don't know what they're talking about. And I'm going to take his word for it because his field seems to understand the whole complexities of male psychology. But that's enough of Radio 4 for now, because I think you get the idea that Jordan Peterson was kind of up against a blockade of people who disagreed with him there. 2 out of the 4 other people on the panel were anyway, especially the presenter, which he may have just been playing devil's advocate, but it may be a Cathy Newman thing where he genuinely believes that Jordan Peterson's wrong, which is fine, but he did seem very, very adept at trying to get Jordan Peterson to stay on his toes, which is fine in one sense, but annoying in another, because Jordan then can't actually get onto things he can properly talk about, because the conversation just keeps going back to this whole gender not being binary, and you can't symbolically have male and female things because they're socially constructed, and he keeps saying, well, they're not, which I think is true. But we'll move on to the topic of Chris Evans's breakfast show. And on this breakfast show, I'm not going to play any clips because I don't think it's necessary. I think what you should do is go and listen to it yourself, because I think it was the best interview for the layman who doesn't really understand Jordan Peterson and doesn't really understand basic psychology or things like that, which isn't a problem. But it's Chris Evans obviously not knowing too much into the deeper issues and just asking Jordan Peterson surface level questions, which is fantastic, because at 8 o'clock in the morning people aren't going to really want to hear deep conversations, and it was deep, but because it's Jordan Peterson it was on the surface level. So I would recommend listening to the Chris Evans breakfast show featuring Jordan Peterson, because there was also a bonus half-hour clip of them talking more about it. I imagine because Chris Evans absolutely loved to talk about it, and to Jordan Peterson, which is understandable. The next show Jordan Peterson was on, which is very mainstream, was the Channel 5 show The Right Stuff, and I will just go put a bit of context into this because I think it's important, and will explain why Matthew Wright, who is the host of the show, actually says what he says. So I think last week it was, one of his guests on the panel said to a transgender person, "You used to be a boy, you will know," on the topic of, you know, men being at the top of hierarchies, as Jordan Peterson would say. And he got in trouble for it, for refusing to apologise for what she had said, even though no one on the panel was offended, and it wasn't a particularly offensive remark. And so he is leaving the show at some point in the future, relatively soon. And so when they get onto the subject of political correctness, which the clip I will show soon, I think it's understandable why Matthew Wright says some of the things he says, but I will leave Jordan Peterson to explain his side, since he is better than me at it.
Force for good or bad, PC?
Well, I think at the moment it's clearly a force for bad. I think it's corrupted the universities, perhaps beyond repair. And I think the reason for that fundamentally is that the PC ideologue types think that the proper way to classify people is by their group affiliation. And there's all sorts of problems with that. One is that there's an endless number of ways that you can classify people by their group affiliation. And that's actually a big technical problem. But more importantly, you need a kind of broad story to tell people about how they should interact with the world. And the story in the West has been that you should fundamentally treat people like the individual is sovereign. And our political system is predicated on that extraordinary and difficult to attain ideal. And to replace that with a collectivist narrative means that we're pushed back into tribal warfare, essentially.
I grew up watching Love Thy Neighbour, and when I look back on it now, it's extraordinary. The one that people just abused themselves, and that was held up as entertainment. Surely, political correctness, we have something to be thankful for, that people abusing each other for the colour of their skin as entertainment on television is a thing of the past. That is a good effect of
Well, I
BBC,
don't
is it
think
not?
that. I don't think that. No, I don't think that you can attribute that to political correctness. I think
What
that you
does it
can.
turn to?
Well, I think that there's been a move over centuries for us to continue to push the idea of the value of each individual into broader and broader domains, to bring everybody under that umbrella. That's been going on probably since the end of the Roman Empire. And to associate that continual improvement with modern PC culture, I think, is a mistake. I mean, the idea of individual sovereignty is deeply embedded in the Judeo-Christian ethic, and it's manifested itself slowly in the political realm over that 2,000-year period. And I think perhaps that's even accelerated over the last 50 years as we become more aware of the necessity of producing situations that allow for equality of opportunity, and to note that that's a social good for everyone. But I'm not willing to credit the neo-Marxist, postmodern, politically correct types with an increase in racial tolerance and gender tolerance and so forth across our culture. I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, the abolition of slavery a couple of hundred years ago was hardly driven by PC culture. So the PC types are going to want to take credit for that, but I don't think there's any reason to assume that they're doing anything but dividing us.
The madman has just said at about 11 o'clock in the morning, when a lot of people will be listening or watching this television show, that political correctness is absolutely detrimental to the liberal principles that the Western world has currently been living on. And that is absolutely amazing, in my opinion.
Slightly tangential, but freedom of speech. In this country, we have freedom of speech within the confines of the law. Is there any other way of having a freedom of speech? We have to exist within some confines, or sometimes I do wonder whether it would just be easier if we just said, to hell with the law, say what you want, deal with it, whatever.
Well, the problem is that people don't think through what freedom of speech means, because they tend to think it means the right to criticize those who are in power, for example, which is one of the things it means. But freedom of speech actually means the freedom to formulate ideas badly and awkwardly in public while you're trying to think them through.
Including offending people?
Well, it's inevitable that you're going to offend people if you're going to talk about anything difficult, because if you talk about something difficult, then people are going to become emotionally involved. And that's especially true if you talk to large numbers of people about something difficult. Like if I address an audience of 1,000 people about anything vaguely contentious, which is obviously something that needs to be thought about, then a small percentage of them are going to be offended. And so what that means is that as your audience scales, or as the importance of the topic increases, your ability to say anything decreases. That's not good.
Just forgive me just for one moment, sir, because I know a little bit about this and I think it might be helpful. Tell me about Bill C-16 and what, this is a Canadian, well, it's Canadian law now. What was it? What was your problem with it? What happened as quickly?
Well, what happened was that under the rubric of laws that purported to extend reasonable protection provisions to transgender people, for example, the government decided that it was okay to compel speech, to force people to use adjectives of a certain type to describe people. And I felt that that was an inappropriate intrusion of the political into the domain of rights, because free speech is the capital right as far as I'm concerned. And it was the willingness of the government to institute compelled speech as a legislative necessity that was what I objected to, because I thought it was a terrible precedent. And I do think it was a terrible precedent. We've had scandals in Canada. Biggest university scandal that ever hit Canada was a direct consequence of Bill C-16 being passed into law. So where a teaching assistant named Lindsay Shepherd was excoriated by her Maoist professors for daring to show a clip of me discussing exactly the sort of thing we're discussing right now in a communications class at Wilfrid Laurier University.
It's amazing to me that on live television, John Peterson has openly called some lecturers in Canada Maoist. That to me is akin to calling Nigel Farage a Nazi. The thing is that John Peterson is a lot more accurate when he says they're Maoist. And having heard the tribunal that Lindsay Shepherd had to go through and how they continuously state untruths, and I will call them untruths, such as kids aren't old enough at the age of 18 to start critically thinking, it is beyond me. These people want social engineering, as Mao did. And the fact that he has just said that openly on TV and openly stated that Bill C-16 mandates speech, which is all true, it'll have telling effects, I think, on the British public, because a lot of people who I have asked who have seen this have said, I can't believe what he said, and then I say, well, it's true, I followed it, and they all go, well, that's a bit worrying then, and so they're all on Jordan Peterson's side, and I think that is a very, very good thing. Everything Jordan Peterson has done up to this point has been a very good thing, undeniably, unless you're a liberal. Before we move on to the next clip, I do want to mention that the other panelist, the woman on the panel, is Sophie Walker, who is the head of the Women's Equalities Party in Great Britain. She is running in Shipley, where Philip Davis, the MRA Tory MP, is running, and he won her out by, I think he got about 31,000 votes, and she got about 300 or something like that. She got barely any of the votes he did. And yet she's invited on shows like this, and I did just want to mention that she is obviously a feminist.
Political correctness restricting freedom of thought, Sophie?
Well, I mean, Jordan's dead right when he says that this is people are worried about offending people. That there is this idea that we can't, we might say the wrong thing and we're only going to get ourselves into trouble. And we've got to find a better way to deal with that, because tolerance is really hard, right? If it was easy, we would have done it by now.
Maybe it's impossible to be tolerant, entirely tolerant.
I think actually, possibly, but I think we can do better. Right, and I think that what essentially this is about is being comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? And I think that freedom of speech assumes equal volume of speech for everybody involved, and we know that that's not the case, right? When you only have to look at Women in Journalism survey.
Freedom of speech doesn't assume equal volume of speech for everyone.
Can I just finish the point I'm making?
There's not much point finishing off your point when you're preemptively stating an untrue fact, when you're saying freedom of speech assumes same volume of speech, and no one is saying that. So what's the point in going on if your presuppositions are all wrong? But I'll let you go on anyway, because it makes you look more of the fool.
There are, when we look at the Women in Journalism survey that found that 78% of front page stories are written by men, and 84% of those stories are about men. And so often the two things get confused as to saying, well, if I speak, if that person speaks, then I can't speak. And that goes to what I was saying earlier about how a backlash is also what is essentially a backlash against the people who are in power.
Yes.
Then often becomes the people in power intellectualizing the backlash to protect the status quo and say, no, you don't understand, this is just how it is. And that's what we have to reject.
I've listened to this waffle about 4 times and I'm still unsure on what she's actually saying. But she seems to be saying that a lot of stories are written by men about men on the front page. And that's just the way it is. But no, intellectually we're not saying that's just the way it is. Jordan Peterson has explained that's the way it is because men dominate higher up in the hierarchy due to men's ability to be more competent in terms of being higher up the hierarchy. You have to be working pretty much 24/7 or very hard workers, which most men aren't. It's just most of the people at the top are men who can do that, and some women. But there's still women at the top. And that's basically all it's saying. They're not saying this is just the way it is. They're explaining this is the way it is because. And you're saying we have to reject that because it doesn't fit into your nice little narrative, as far as I can tell anyway. So that's about as deep and interesting as the political correctness conversation went. But there's an even more interesting connection that the Sophie Walker made with Jordan Peterson. And this is about the Cathy Newman interview. But I'm going to let this clip pretty much run its course because there's no point in me really talking because Jordan Peterson just does a better job than I kind of actually did refuting what the woman said. But that's about as interesting as the political correctness debate got. I'm going to now move on to his whole main point about universities and how when he makes the point that there are obviously people in universities trying to just take down the system we have now, the response from Sophie Walker is basically just an ad hominem attack, like, are you saying this is getting people threatened by the alt-right? Which is, honestly, I'm just going to let this whole thing run its course, generally, because it's absolutely amazing.
I believe that you believe that there is some kind of Marxist-influenced, post-modernist plot that's hatching in our universities hatched in our universities to do what? What is this conspiracy?
Well, the stated goals of the conspiracy, so to speak, can be found on the websites of disciplines like women's studies. It's to bring down the oppressive patriarchal structure of the West. And that's a deadly serious aim by all means possible, including an assault on the basic categories that we use to orient ourselves in the world. And so the theory is driven by the idea that the best way to construe Western civilization is as a power structure basically produced by men for men that's fundamentally oppressive and that needs to be dismantled from the bottom up. And so it's easy to find out what the aim is because it's stated very clearly, to produce activists to bring that about. And that's especially true of disciplines like women's studies and the cultural studies disciplines.
You hate those courses, don't you?
Well, it's not so much that I hate them, it's that I'm embarrassed to be part of the university because of what the universities are doing.
You claim that there's sort of pseudoscience or false science.
It's not a claim. It's absolutely the case that it's not even, you can't even call it pseudoscience because it's not science. It's just driven by a set of ideological presuppositions, the most pernicious of which is that the best way to understand history and understand people is as a consequence of their group identity, which is unbelievably dangerous because what it does is push us back towards a tribal direction. You know, one of the things that I love about England, about the UK in general, is that over the course of any reasonable historical development, Britain developed the idea of the sovereignty of the individual and instantiated that into the political system. So that the notion was that you should always view people as individuals first and as members of a collective, if at all, far second. And that's what accounts for the spread of freedom and productivity and democracy throughout the world. And the universities are doing everything they can to critique that at the most fundamental level possible, all in the name of some false compassion and hypothetical equality.
To go through a whole monologue, basically, of saying certain university courses aren't even science, they're just activist courses to get people to take down a system that they have a problem with for certain reasons is absolutely amazing to me. He just went off on one about universities. And honestly, a lot of people in the UK are very sceptical about universities. The only reason kids really go to them is because we're now railroaded into going into it, really. And if you can't, you're seen as some sort of a failure, which I don't think is fair. And because of this, they've ended up propping up these courses. Because the university I went to, you could get a minor in gender studies or something like that. Luckily, there's no major because the one I went to is actually pretty good, but it's just mental. But it's only going to grow because to get all the people through uni, you have to make more courses. And it's ridiculous and it's not helping anyone. But this is Sophie's reply.
Come on, Sophie. I voted for your party. I voted for you in the London mayoral elections. What do you say to that? What do you say to that?
Well, I suppose my question is, you call yourself a sort of classic British liberal. And I was very interested to see that description of you. And I'm also fascinated by your book about, dealing with the chaos in which, as you yourself say, men find themselves in, or it's predominantly aimed at men.
No,
and
it's
I think
not,
that. Oh well, I'd read an article with you in which you sort of said, well, yes, it probably is mainly men. So that's what I'm basing that on. I think so. Taking all that into account, why do you think it is that so much of what you say is so very popular with the alt-right?
It isn't, and you don't have any evidence for that at all.
Oh dear, Sophie, you try and ad-hom him with your guilt by association fallacies that aren't even based on evidence. You've run into a railroad of every single thing that John Peterson is about to say. You deserve, because what you have just said is ridiculous. But I'm going to let a man who is much greater than me explain why.
Well, Any more than the evidence that alt-right people
Daily
watch this
Stormer,
show?
Neo-Night website, Saviour of Western Civilization.
Oh, well, that was all taken apart today by a number of Jewish publications, by the way, showing that, first of all, that was all satirical commentary on the part of the alt-right, directed at taking me down, for example. And there was an alt-right article yesterday published saying that I was a Jewish stooge and shill. So, well, this is absolute nonsense, and I don't appeal primarily to the alt-right. There's no evidence for that at all. It's the proclivity of...
I never said primarily, Jordan. What I'm interested in is why you think that you get the reaction that you do from the alt-right. Looking at, the Cathy Newman documentary.
What reaction?
Interview.
He's just explained that the reaction he got from the alt-right is that they're trying to take him down, and you've just asked him, why do you think you get that reaction? Well, I can tell you, it's because he says if you play identity politics, you're playing a dangerous game that never ends well for anyone, so don't play it. That's why the alt-right are against him, but you still think they're with him because it fits your narrative.
There's 10 million people watched that and commented on it.
I'm talking about what I saw, and I'm curious to know what your reaction was to the glee with which the alt-right seized upon that.
So I don't accept.
Should we deal with the death threats? I mean, she had, I think, a dozen.
I don't accept the
death
concept that it was the alt-right that was doing this. There were 10 million people who commented on that video, and about 95% of them commented negatively on Cathy Newman's behaviour. You think there's 10 million alt-right trolls watching that?
Did you not? You accused her of spinning a victim narrative in an interview with the Radio Times.
You mean what Cathy did afterwards?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly what happened.
But wasn't that because Cathy Newman, for quite a while, and she's a great accomplished journalist,
Well said.
just sat there looking at you with her mouth open and slowly closing like a goldfish because she didn't know what to say.
That seems to remind me of someone on this show.
And so she was coming back afterwards and making the point, well, actually, I did know what to say, but I was giving you time, or words that
But given what she said, I'm going to find that and kill her. I'm going to find that and execute her. Is that spinning a victim narrative when you get that popping up in your Twitter inbox?
Well, it depends on what happened with Channel 4 was that they put the whole interview up, which was quite a shock to me because I didn't think they would. And then people were vitriolically opposed to what had happened. And so there were hundreds of thousands of comments. And when you get hundreds of thousands of comments, there's going to be some subset like this. And people did analysis of these comments, by the way, and showed that the bulk of the ones that were vitriolic in terms of percentages were actually directed at me, not at her. And it was in the best interests of the Channel 4 people to spin this as a victim narrative, because that's what they do anyways, but to construe Cathy Newman, who's...
Did you get death threats, though?
I've had death threats. I don't know if I got them specifically because of that interview, because I hadn't said anything contentious, but that certainly happened to me. And seriously enough, so the university increased security around my office. But I mean, when you're dealing with people, when you're dealing with millions of people's comments, then there's going to be a percentage of them that are produced by people who are, well, not mentally well to begin with. And I also tweeted out afterwards. You know, after this had gone on for a couple of days, I tweeted out something asking people to lay off her because enough was enough.
Yes, you did.
I do want to comment on Jordan Peterson's absolute insane performance here, because he is saying, look, she's got a lot of negative, comments about this. Obviously, some of them are going to go too far. I went out of my way to say, don't go too far, because it's stupid. And then he's going on about, look, I've actually had death threats. I am actually a victim of some of these things, but he doesn't spin it in such a way that you should feel sorry for me. He's spinning it in such a way of, well, I'm a public figure who is saying important and not contentious, but things that go against the mold of some people in power, and from some people in the public opinion. So obviously I'm gonna go in a bad way. And then he's had to have security raised at his office, and he's not saying that, like, as I said, don't think of me as a victim. Just think of it as this is the type of thing that happens, and I can't prove the type of people that did this, and he's not assigning blame to anyone. It's just a much better way to make a victim narrative, and it's made him look insanely good. So having been on form throughout this so far, and to be honest, just red-pilling the people that have watched it, he then moves on to the subject of equality of opportunity and outcome. And obviously, since we have a feminist, she is then trying to say, we need equality of opportunity and outcome. And of course, Jordan Peterson expertly takes us down, as we see here.
What do you understand by equality, Sophie? What does it mean to you?
Freedom.
Your manifesto mandated having 50-50 wage split in your companies. You do not want freedom. You want fucking social engineering, you liar.
Can you be more... Is it equality of opportunity? Is it equal pay across the board? Is it something more than that?
I think equality's better for everyone. I think,
okay.
And I'm really delighted, I love my job because it's an optimistic and a hopeful job, which is about creating more choices for people. I'm interested in people being able to have different choices and having equality of outcome.
You can't start your point with, I want freedom, and then end your point with, I want equality of outcome. They are mutually exclusive targets to aim for. And you've just made yourself look like an idiot to anyone that understands that.
Aha. Well, so you're going to have choices and equality of outcome. What if people choose different things, which is what they've been doing in Scandinavia? So the Scandinavian countries have moved more towards gender equality than any other countries, and the personality differences in Scandinavia have increased rather than decreased, and the proportion of women who are choosing STEM fields has decreased rather than increased. So as cultures become more gender neutral, the number of women who choose STEM fields decreases.
What do you mean by STEM fields?
So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So if you let men and women make their choices, what actually happens is that they specialize in different situations, and you don't get equality of outcome.
Could they not have been programmed to have those views from the moment we raise them and give boys Lego and construction?
No, because what happens is that as countries get more egalitarian, which means there's less programming of that sort, the differences get larger, not smaller. And the scientific data on that is clear, and most of it was generated by people who have a left-leaning bias, so you can't blame it on conservative scientists. It was a shock to everyone to find that out.
Sophie,
I think the difference between Jordan and me is that we look at evidence and we lean towards different theories.
But your theory goes against the evidence. You say that there's a patriarchy because of the way we've brought up. Well, in Scandinavian countries, the way that we've been brought up has been slowly more gender equal, we'll say. And that's meant that women go more off to more, female orientated subjects, such as nursing, we'll say. And men have gone to engineering. And you're saying that that's still a patriarchy, even though your version of a patriarchy has been slowly deconstructed throughout Scandinavia? You can't use that. That's just ridiculous, as I've said.
So Jordan's theory is very much evolutionary, that there are inherent differences in men and women. Mine is very much more social role theory, if you like, and that men and women are taking on different roles due to the expectations that society puts on them. And it's interesting that Jordan frequently cites Scandinavian countries where they've made more, there's nowhere in the world that women are equal, but Scandinavia has made the most progress towards shared parenting, etc. Yep. That said, it's not done yet. There's nowhere in the world where this is done yet.
But it's having the opposite effect that the gender equality types predicted. Opposite, not the same. And it isn't a theory, it's actually data driven by tens of thousands of surveys and the best scientific literature on the topic. It's not a theory, and I didn't come about it because of my political perspective. I looked at the data. What it showed was that as countries become more egalitarian, the differences between men and women grow. They don't shrink.
So what I'm interested in is data and analysis.
I do really wish you'd stop lying about that.
And I'm particularly interested in the ones presented, such as the ones by the University of Southern California, which discovered that change towards gender equality is actually being slowed by beliefs that are legitimizing social inequalities on the basis of sex. And I'm also interested, like Jordan, I look at the data and I look at the studies, and I'm really also very much interested in studies like the analysis that was done by the American Psychological Society, which looked at 45 analysis of whether there's sex difference over 20 years. And its conclusion was that men and women are basically alike in terms of personality, in terms of cognitive ability, in terms of leadership. But what it did find was that media depictions of men and women as fundamentally different perpetuate misconceptions, as does workplace bias.
Oh God, so it's my fault.
So, no, well, you're leaving soon. It's okay.
Men and women actually are more the same than they are different. But the issue is that small differences at the population level can turn into very large differences at the extreme. So, for example, men and women are broadly similar with regards to aggression, although men tilt a little bit more towards aggression. So that if you picked a random person out of the population, male and female, and you guessed that the male was more aggressive, you'd be right 60% of the time. But if you take the 1 in 100 most aggressive people, they're all male. And that's why the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that, just out of curiosity? What about bricklayers? They're 99% male. And we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that?
These are points that are never, ever brought up toward feminists in UK media. And the fact that Jordan Peterson is doing it, and that the reply to this is just a simple attack on his character again, just shows that people are going to be listening to him because he makes sense, and he gives people enough rope to hang themselves with, and then after that he draws and quarters them afterwards, because he can then just dismantle what they said and refute it. It's amazing. He's the best thing to happen to come to this country for a while.
And men work longer hours. They work more dangerous jobs. They're more likely to move. They're more likely to work outside. They're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable. They make more money for those reasons. And that's all hidden under the idea that the reason that men and women make different amounts of money is because of their gender. It's a very simplistic analysis, and trying to
Michael,
address
I was just going to say, Sophie, can you come back on that?
What I'm trying to equalise is opportunity and choice.
Fine, let's
And
equalise choice.
You agree on that.
But we won't get equal outcome that way.
And I think that what happens then, nobody knows, because we've never done it yet.
We do know. We know what's happened in Scandinavia.
But it's not fully got there yet.
No, but it's going in the opposite direction that everyone predicted, and strongly.
I think one of the things I loved about Jordan's book, which I speed read last night, so forgive me, Jordan, I've not read every line. But one of my favourite rules in Jordan's book is Rule 9, which says, assume the person you are listening to might know something you don't.
Classic. Jordan has just destroyed every point you made, and you try and move on to another point, bringing a rule from his book that, from what I can tell, he is actually following, because he's actually refuting every single point you're making, and trying to say he's not following it. This is amazing. Amazing work. You're making yourself look a prick.
And I think that in a country where men outnumber women by 2 to 1 in Parliament, in local government, where women's voices are not equally represented in media, where our education systems still are teaching boys and girls ideas of pink and blue. What I'm trying to do is work with thousands of optimistic, hopeful people for change.
Okay.
Oh, never mind. She's just going to imply it and then just bring back around another point that she has already made before, and Jordan has explained why it is just a stupid idea. Nothing much else of value is really said on it, up until we get the viewers' calls in, and he gets one in, and I think although it's only one anecdotal call, I do think he represents quite a large part of British society, of people that watch the right stuff anyway.
I owe it to the viewers to hear their views on this.
We've got Salim calling from Manchester.
Salim, good morning.
Hi Matthew, how you doing?
I'm very well. I'm loving it. I'm a pig in heaven today. What do we think about equality? Will it ever happen, Salim?
I was going to say I thought it was going to happen, but after listening to Jordan, he's swayed my opinion.
Conquering thoughts and minds alike. Jordan Peterson, you changed one person's mind, and that is beyond worth it for you to come here and go on all these shows you have gone on. Well done, my good sir. I can't help but congratulate you.
Why did you think it was going to happen?
Because I think we're going to become more cognitive creatures, and jobs are going to be more about mental skills.
Technology.
But then I've been visited schools, and I work in STEM. I'm a software developer, and the number of women doing software development hasn't increased. I would have thought they would have increased more, but I went into secondary school to do GCSE IT stuff, and there's very, very few girls doing IT, and I was thinking IT is the future, and the schools are pushing for more girls to go into IT, but there's only I visited about 8 schools.
Can I just, sorry, Salim, can I just because I 30 seconds. Sophie's idea, actually, representations in the media could be affecting such choices. Geeks, we see geeks, bespectacled blokes with bad hair on computers. That's what tech means, isn't it?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, because I think actually that one of the other things we want to do is to have a look at curriculums, to have more female role models, to encourage girls, because so long as we still see STEM as a boys' area that we're trying to get girls into, it's not going to work. We need to do the work we're doing on care, get more boys thinking about, nursing, teaching, more role models for boys in schools.
And
that's the way you break it all
on
down.
programmes like EastEnders, The Archers, that's helped them a lot.
Right, so, listen, I have to draw things to a conclusion.
This is the thing, I don't actually necessarily disagree that, seeing people on the media won't influence people. I don't think it's a bad idea, because it happened with Scully from The X-Files when she was a doctor in that show. There was a sharp increase in women having an interest in medicine, So I'm not actually against that, but I don't think it's going to end up having it 50-50. And I think the problem is that Sophie is only going to say we're going to need more women on TV displaying this until we have 50-50. And that's obviously never going to happen. But I don't actually disagree with their point there. But still, the fact that Jordan Peterson has inevitably changed a lot of people's minds who have watched this, I think is beyond a shadow of the doubt the best thing I have seen in a while. And Matthew Wright's reaction was just fantastic. I thank him very much for having Jordan Peterson on. The next show that I'm going to move on to is The Daily Politics, a daily show on political commentary and updates on what's happening in the political sphere. And it's actually a very good show. It's very good when they have Andrew Neil on, but unfortunately it was Joe Coburn, who, again, is a good questioner. And I feel she was more playing devil's advocate. And I only say that because I used to watch Daily Politics, well, daily. But I do think she was playing very much devil's advocate here. But that just means I'm annoyed at the producers who asked her to ask this question towards him, and I'm just going to let it run because it is absolutely abhorrent how this was asked and what it led to.
So, Jordan, you've done endless interviews. You've been publicising your book, and they've generated plenty of heated debate.
And I actually sold out the Apollo. It had 5,000 seats.
All right, stop boasting. Do you think, though, because of the heat that has been generated, that your views have been misrepresented at times?
Oh, definitely, but that's part and parcel of the process. I did take a very forceful stance, let's say, against some of the excesses of the radical left-wingers, and it's in their best interest to paint me as somehow a figure of the extreme right, because then I don't have to be contended with. But, I mean, it's easy for people's views to be oversimplified in a very large public debate.
I mean, in terms of some of the issues, I mean, you say you've been painted as an extreme right-winger.
No, some people have tried that. Not very successfully, but they've tried it.
And you came to prominence in part over your opposition to this law that we just talked about in Canada, proposing the use of preferred pronouns for transgender people. Just for clarity...
Mandating them.
Yeah.
Right.
Saying that you should do it.
No, that you had to do it.
Right, you had to do it by law. But just for clarity, do you think a trans woman is a real woman?
Now, I can see why you would think that has anything to do with the law. But after everything he has said about the law and everything in every public interview he has said about the law, he has made it very clear that it is just because the Canadian government overstepped their mark of going beyond British common law and saying you have to mandate speech. We are mandating speech, and that's what he has always been against because he knows what it leads to. Why you're asking this question is beyond me, and I think it is abhorrent and a leading question to go into. However, John being John, he just absolutely nails his defence.
I don't really like the way those questions are formulated. You know, I don't know what that means. What do you mean a real woman?
Well, I'm asking you, in your mind, you know, it depends what you think a real woman is, but do you think a trans woman is a woman?
It is on the interviewer to define the words they are using. If you just say a real woman, this is why he thinks it's leading, by the way. It can mean pretty much anything. And the fact that Jordan is struggling to answer it is because he doesn't know exactly what you're trying to ask, so he's trying to ask for clarification. So if you're asking him to clarify himself, he's obviously just got to try and fall into a trap, but he does his absolute best to avoid it, and I think successfully.
No.
Why not?
Because I think that women are capable, generally speaking, of having babies, and they have female genitalia, and they have an XX chromosome, and I think the biological markers are relevant. It doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think that people should be treated with respect and dignity if they happen not to fit easily into a gender category. That's a different issue.
Right.
But it's a matter of definition. And I actually think it's a foolish argument in some sense. Because what do you mean by real?
Well, I mean, you've just clarified that, though. You don't think that a trans woman is a woman.
No, he said they're not real women, which is a different thing to a woman, I imagine.
And do you think that that is what is behind or explains your opposition to this idea of a law mandating you to use a preferred pronoun, is because you don't actually believe that that's the truth, that a trans woman is a woman and therefore you can't use that pronoun?
No, that's not my argument at all.
Really?
Yeah, really. My argument is that the government shouldn't compel voluntary...
Joe, if you're saying you know what his argument is, why are you asking him things that aren't part of his argument? If you're like, that doesn't make any sense. that just says to me that you don't really understand his argument and you don't really care about it. You just want to paint him badly. Not that I blame you, Joe. I'm blaming your producers and the people who gave you these questions. Unless you did it yourself, in which case I blame you. But I don't
Free
speech.
No, but I know what your argument is, and
No,
you've
but
made
that's
it very
really
clearly.
it. No, but that's exactly it. There's
But the
no behind.
motivation
There's
behind
no motivation
it.
behind it.
But you don't believe
I
a
wouldn't
trans
put
woman is a woman.
everything on my online in my life to take the stance I did unless I had thought that through very deeply. And I've thought it through very deeply. There aren't hidden motivations that have to do with some arbitrary prejudice against trans people.
Okay.
It's pure and simply this. There's never been a time in English common law history where the government compelled speech, and the Canadian government dared to do that. And that was unacceptable. And they masked it with this show of compassion for the oppressed, and I don't buy it.
Right, but you would, as I think you said, at an individual level, if somebody asked you, if somebody asked you to use a particular pronoun, you would do so.
Well, I have.
You have?
Yes.
Right, fine.
All that to waste time and end up just finding out that he's not a bigot after all. What was the point? People know that. People aren't interested in watching him to find out if he's a bigot. People watch him because of the things he has to say, which are very deep and insightful. So you've just wasted a good 5 minutes asking him pointless questions, even though you knew his argument. And that's really annoying. But thank you, Jordan Peterson. You have again annihilated any type of opposition towards you, because it's pathetic.
Yes. Let's talk about feminism. Are you a feminist?
Oh, you're opening the bomb doors for another truth bomb here, Peterson.
No, not as it's currently defined, certainly not.
No.
Ooh, this is... I think this is why people like him. He's very principled, and he definitely understands the things he's talking about. Like, this is amazing.
Well, in any other definition?
Well, I think that anybody who doesn't think that the competitive landscape should be opened up for equality of opportunity is not thinking. And so everyone's interests are better served if people have as equal access to opportunity to display their talents and to manifest their talents in the world as possible. So in that sense, certainly. But feminism now, and this is why it's so deeply unpopular, a very small minority of women in the UK identify as feminists. And the reason for that is it's primarily become an ideological weapon. And it's an ideology that I detest, actually, the ideology that it's associated with, collectivist ideology.
Right. I mean, okay, and that's your view about feminism.
And it seems to me that it's a rather popular view of feminism, given that, as he said, a small minority of women actually identify as feminist in this country. Well, let's move on to the feminist perspective of feminism.
Aisha, are you a feminist?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a very proud feminist. And when I was a special advisor in government, I worked on women and equality issues, and I was very proud actually of a piece of legislation I got on the statute book with my former boss Haryan, the Equality Act in 2010, which strengthened our anti-discrimination laws. And I fought very hard to get more women into public life, into the Labour Party, and I'm very, very proud of being a feminist, hence my pink dress.
Oh, well, all right.
See, that reaction is why I think Jo is just a devil's advocate here, because she just kind of says, oh, all right, because all that woman did was just give off a load of stuff about her ego and give off a load of virtue signaling, which I'm sorry I had to put you through, but I think it puts the point through that it's not really the interviewers that are the problem here, it's the whole media behind it. And Jordan Peterson is absolutely conquering it. He's winning battle after battle, and this is another battle that he's absolutely won. Because when I ask people, I show them these clips and they're like, right, is he wrong? And they're like, well, no, trans women obviously aren't real women because they are incapable of doing the biological processes that real women, quote unquote, can actually do. And then, are you a feminist? Well, no, because of this, that, and the other. And then it's like, all right, let's hear the feminist say something. Oh, she's just got a massive ego and is narcissistic. Brilliant. Well, this is why I didn't mind the question, and it's why I don't mind Jo. But we'll carry
obviously reverting to type then
absolutely,
in the pink dress.
Well,
you would like men to regain or reclaim their strength physically, mentally and morally. Is that broadly correct?
I would say morally, fundamentally, but I think the other things go along with that.
Right, and if that
But it isn't men precisely who I'm speaking to. It's people. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm actually interested in individuals, and I'm interested in their fortification against tragedy. You know, every time I do an interview, the interview is always political. It's always political.
Well, the clue is in the title of this programme. We are the Daily Politics.
No, fair enough. No, look, fair enough. And I'm not casting aspersions at this programme, but the fundamental news that's important about what I'm doing isn't the political element. And the people who talk to me don't talk politically. They say they've watched my lectures.
But part
and
of it is...
I do find it funny that when Peterson says that he doesn't talk politically, everyone in the media doesn't really understand what that means. And I think that just shows how politicised the media is, because as the feminist is about to explain, politics is everywhere in their mind. And it's just weird.
I think for a lot of people, the kind of personal does become the political.
Or the political becomes the personal.
Yeah, and I think in terms of
but in this situation, a lot of people are wrong, because primarily what's happening is people are watching my lectures, and as a consequence, their lives are improving dramatically.
Oh, I'm sure they are. I'm sure people are have had a huge conversion after, and they're much happier once they've been.
It's not a conversion.
But what I would like to do is kind of almost. I think at the moment the discussion about feminism is very divisive, and sometimes it can sort of be like, okay, men have to lose and women have to gain. Actually, everybody has a lot to gain by greater equality. Now, whether you get the equality of outcome that you want, I think only time will tell. But certainly, equality of opportunity is very important. And actually,
we can agree on that.
And a lot of men would benefit from that. So I think a lot of men are having a lot of crises at the moment in terms of mental health, suicide issues, their own sense of identity, because I think some of the stereotypes put on men are quite limiting for them as well. I think they make men quite unhappy as well.
The devil's in the details with regards to equality, because I'm an advocate of equality of opportunity. But I think the idea outcomes, that's an appalling doctrine.
Why?
Another area where I think Joe is actually playing devil's advocate is if you listen to the tone of those two whys, they are completely different. The feminist says why is in why. Why is opportunity of outcome wrong? You must be wrong about that. Whereas Joe's is more like, why? Can you explain that? Because I'd be interested to find out why. And that's why I think she is more of a devil's advocate and a good interviewer, really. Certainly better than Cathy Newman. But considering she's a political commentator, she is very good at differentiating between personal and political issues, which I think is very good.
All right. Well,
because you have to produce an unbelievably potent bureaucracy to make the ever greater and ever finer distinctions that are necessary to enforce equality of outcome. How many group differences are you going to equalize across? Is it just gender and sex? How many genders?
No,
gender and ethnicity? How many genders? How many ethnicities? How many races?
We'll let Ayesha answer.
I think what people are trying to do with this, and certainly as somebody who has sought to sort of do this myself, I think you set yourself ambitions for what you would like to see, and then you try and remove as many of the structural barriers and obstacles. So you try and create that fair crack of the whip and that equality of opportunity to see where you get to with the outcomes.
That's
now,
fine.
We are in very early stages. It's only 100 years since women got the vote in this country. We have had a long established patriarchal society and set up for a long time in the world in this country. So I think we have a long way to go to see where it plays out. There is no country in the world where we really do have gender equality properly yet in terms of real decision making and real
some of the
power.
Scandinavian countries maybe,
but they're still not quite there. And I think you've spoken a lot about this. There's still a way to go in Scandinavia. Things are not perfect in Scandinavia.
I haven't spoken about that specifically. I've spoken about.
You spoke about the right stuff yesterday. You talked about the Scandinavia.
Well, I've spoken about the fact that, see, one of the things that's happened in the analysis of the differences between men and women is that the social constructionist claim is that the differences are socially constructed, right? Is that it's a consequence of environment that men and women differ. But what the scientific literature indicates is that as cultures become more egalitarian, like they have in Scandinavia, the differences between men and women actually increase rather than decreasing, which is a direct repost to the social constructionist view. So they just deny all that. The biggest differences in the world in interest and temperament are between Scandinavian men and women. It's exactly the opposite of what everyone predicted.
Can I just pick up on one thing you said a little earlier in the interview, which you said it's the moral guidance that you are focused on. You think that is particularly important. How do you square that with the behaviour of perhaps arguably, a prominent alpha male president of the United States, Donald Trump, when his behaviour, I mean, he is accused of having an affair with a porn star when his wife was pregnant. How does that fit with morally reclaiming?
Well, I would say that was rather clearly immoral.
Right.
Yeah,
but you would still,
not to be a target for emulation.
But you still would have voted for him over Hillary Clinton as an identity politics. I mean, it's just how
none
do
of that
you
was on the table, and I said I might have voted for him on a whim. That's all.
But you also did say you started out feeling quite close to Hillary Clinton. Can I just come on the
very quickly?
He does a very good job of actually refuting this, because he's basically saying, I voted for Trump because he was less immoral than Hillary Clinton in terms of his politics. And he's like, yeah, Donald Trump's immoral. I never said he wasn't. And I'm not voting for him for his personality. I'm voting for the politics, which is a fair enough point. But the feminist is like, oh, but you liked Hillary Clinton. He's like, well, yeah, I did at one point. It's like, yeah, he can change his mind. It's just that whole segment is just a bit weird, but I thought it was worth watching. Anyway, the feminist goes off on one at the end about pro-life policies, but that's an entirely different issue in my opinion. And I think, I don't know Jordan Peterson's personal position on it, but I can't imagine him saying that, you know, mandating birth. I can't imagine him being against abortion, basically, but I could be wrong on that. Because he has said before that he is actually more on the liberal side of things. He just understands the nuances. But that's all the battles I wanted to go through that Jordan Peterson actually did. There was one more event that he did in for BBC Radio 3, which is Free Thinking, which is a late evening show. But not many people will be watching it. And to be honest, I think it's just worth listening to that in the background while you're doing something else, because that one is mainly funny because the interviewer giving the interview gets really flustered, and I don't think he really understands the thing he's talking about and what Peterson's trying to explain to him. So I don't think it's really worth it. Whereas the rest of these people do seem to understand what he's saying and just making idiots out of themselves. Whereas I feel bad for the guy on Radio 3 because he says he's a professor of literature, I think it was, but because it's just of literature, he doesn't really understand the whole philosophical meaning behind the myths and things that Jordan's trying to explain, and why he can put symbolic feminine and masculine things and attribute it to certain phenomenons in the world. But yeah, that's it. Jordan Peterson, congratulations. Your campaign through the UK media has been a undoubtedly successful one, and I say that because the people I've asked who have seen you all seem to agree with you, and all seem to, well, we're entertained by you, really. That's the general image I can get from the laymen of the world who don't really concentrate on these areas that you focus on. So thank you very much for coming over, Jordan Peterson, and to everyone who managed to get through this hour of rambling from myself, I thank you very, very much for watching, and I will see you next time.